Hi. We continue in Luke 5 today in the middle part of the chapter 5, verses 12 to 16, as you can see on the right side of the screen. After the situation with Simon and his companions on the boat and the call to be fishing people, we turn to a whole different scene in a different place. And as I indicated in the beginning of this chapter, unlike chapter 4, these stories are not tied together by geography or chronology. Luke has simply juxtaposed several different stories for his own reasons, and we'll look at one of the reasons in a minute, without linking them by suggesting that Jesus is going from the previous one to the next one immediately. So we don't know how much time has taken place in between. And in our scene here, we don't even know where it's taking place. It's the vague description when he was in one of the cities. And plainly the point there is to not limit it geographically, to put the focus not on that, as we saw in the Nazareth versus Capernaum patronage, honor, shame kind of rivalry in chapter 4, but to highlight on some other issues. And this is the first time we're seeing an actual leper in Luke's gospel. We saw a reference to Naaman the Syrian was a leper, and that'll come back to us here in chapter 4. That was in chapter 4. It'll come back to us here in chapter 5. But we saw there the example was not about leprosy. The example was about healing a Gentile, and that Jesus on God's behalf would not favor the people of Israel, and not specifically the people of Nazareth, over others. But now that story is going to come back in an interesting way. One of the tools that we have to use to interpret the Bible well is to check our presuppositions. And the story here about leprosy and healing and various related things like the priests and Moses carries many presuppositions, both for ordinary readers and for scholars. So what we're going to need to do today is check how we come at this story and see how scholars really just in the last few years are beginning to change some of their own presuppositions that were based simply on repeating them again and again without going back and seeing if that was true. So let's start here with ways not to read New Testament healing and exorcism stories. And in a way, this isn't a healing story, it's a cleansing story. And as we'll see, the Greek word for be made clean is only in leprosy stories, with one exception in Luke's gospel. But I'm still going to include it here because it involves many of the same themes that we'll see in things that we might think of otherwise as healings and exorcisms. So 5 examples of how not to read it. 1, as miracles. And this may be challenging because your translation, unlike my new RSV here on the left side of the screen, may say miracles in places. But the fact of the matter is there's 2 issues here. One is there's no word in biblical Greek or Hebrew for miracle. There's simply not. Words that are translated as miracle in Hebrew can mean mighty act or powerful act, and similarly in the New Testament, sometimes it's a powerful work or powerful act. But the main issue isn't that there isn't a word for it, although that's important. There's no concept for it. Because the very definition of miracle suggests in most people's minds, quote-unquote, breaking the laws of nature. But the laws of nature as a concept is a function of the Enlightenment and a Newtonian view of things that separates out, for Newton's being able to preserve the power of God as a person of faith that he was, as well as the scientific principles by which he understood that God had ordered the universe, so-called natural law. And so to make that work, he separated in his own mind reality of creation, at least, into 2 realms, the natural and the supernatural. Supernatural simply from the Latin meaning above nature. And that concept can be helpful for some purposes, but it's not a biblical concept and wasn't a Christian concept at all until the Enlightenment, until relatively recently. So miracle is simply a wrong notion. There's nothing about God or Jesus here breaking the laws of nature because that concept didn't exist. The flip side of that, also out of the Enlightenment, is what one scholar called as the extreme arrogance of our generation, as trying to replace the biblical language as if it's naive or quote-unquote primitive with more modern, scientifically explainable ways of talking about it. And so, for example, we'll see other people who are acting in ways that someone doesn't accept that they're possessed by a demon because that kind of language doesn't fit in our world, so they can be characterized as an epileptic or a schizophrenic. But there are challenges with that too. And as we know, the medical explanation of mental illness is not nearly as sharp as we might imagine. Here are a couple of books just recently that I've read that might help provide some sense of what's at issue here in mental illness. Although we're not talking about mental illness here, it overlaps. One here, this book, Nobody's Normal, by a psychiatrist, recognizing that what has happened is that medical professionals created a stigma stigma, and society's created a stigma around people that separates them if they have a mental illness from other people. And we'll see that's very close to the presuppositions about lepers in the world of Jesus. So another book like that here, The Mind and the Moon, which is highlighting how chemicals, pharmaceuticals given by doctors to supposedly help mental illnesses like depression and schizophrenia have no scientific basis at all for why they work. And two books among many that are highlighting that both scientists and doctors aren't really as scientific and medical as they might imagine they are, or want us to imagine they are, about things like mental illness or things we might characterize as demonic behavior. But also, what they purport to do doesn't necessarily have a basis either, at least not a basis in science. So we have to be careful not to try to impose a modern scientific view on this as if that's a better way to look at it than the way the Bible looks at it. A third issue is the Jesus exception, as if Jesus, by being human and divine, has special magical powers that distinguish him from regular humans. Although, if that were the case, then how could Jesus expect, as he does in Luke and the other Gospels, his ordinary human disciples to do what he does? And we'll see later how he sends them out to heal and cast out unclean spirits and evil spirits. So if it was Jesus' special power, he couldn't possibly pass that on to anybody else. Similarly, this is not proof of Jesus' divinity or messiahship, as I've often seen people, perhaps not scholars, but people in churches think, well, Jesus could perform miracles and that proves he was God. Well, we already talked about miracles, but there's nothing here about that as a matter of proof. If Jesus is Son of God, and that's what people think makes him divine, or Messiah, there's nothing in the tradition that suggests that either of those titles was associated with special powers of any kind. The Son of God was meant to be a divinely associated king or priest to do what kings and priests do, not to do something beyond that. And finally, one thing we need to avoid is assuming that our separate categories of quote-unquote physical cure and quote-unquote social acceptance within healing stories, that those are separate, that physical healing is something that perhaps doctors do or pharmaceuticals do, and social acceptance is something that society does. But those are separate categories that didn't exist in the ancient world, that people's bodily integrity and the various aspects of their body overlapped into social acceptance. So we can't impose our categories on them. Another thing that's important for us to pay attention to here, in this story, as we can see in verse 13, Jesus touches the man, and the narrator tells us immediately the leprosy left him. But many disability advocates, especially from a Christian perspective, have challenged the normativity of come to Jesus and he will heal your disabilities. Because what about people who have great faith and are disabled, but nothing happens? And so there's been a huge movement of disability studies around the Bible and theology. And I'm just going to put up here on the screen 3 images of recent books on that topic. And full disclosure, I've not read any of these, but they're all highly recommended by scholars I accept and approve of as solid. So depending upon your perspective, the first one is from Amos Young, a self-described Pentecostal, The Bible, Disability, and the Church. So there's one to consider. If you're coming from an evangelical perspective that's not Pentecostal, you might find Bethany McKinney Fox's Disability and the Way of Jesus a helpful one. And from a wider ecumenical group of scholars, including Young, here's The Bible and Disability, a commentary. So I'll put links to those on the webpage. But just to highlight that there are people who are not buoyed up, do not find it good news to know that once upon a time Jesus healed somebody's disability but didn't heal theirs. Another thing I'd like to do as we start, before we look at this passage, and recognize that we're in a scene here that's been memorialized in art in many ways, because it's a poignant scene. What we've seen before is not, in Luke, at least in the last chapter, is not necessarily susceptible to visual imagery, but this one is. And so 3 images just to highlight the way this has been portrayed. And the main thing I hope you can see here is the physical intimacy between Jesus and the leper. So here the classic sketch painting from Rembrandt from the 1650s. And then here's another from 1912 from a stained glass window in a church in South Carolina, St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. The attribution is the Quaker City Glass Company, but I like this one because you can see how close they are. And then finally, this painting by Niels Larsen Stevens, more recently, that has a lot of nice color and highlights it. The social separation does not mean that this is a gray or a black and white image, that there's still a lot of life going on there. So with those things in mind, let's enter into our story. And as we do, I need to also back up just a little bit on our assumptions about leprosy. And I'm using a couple of resources that frankly challenge my own views that were in my notes. So I'm updating this with very recent material here that I hope is helpful to you. One here is from Myrick Chanel Jr., and you can see this is from 2018. And here's a picture of him. He's both a medical doctor and surgeon and has a doctorate in religion. So he's combining both his trainings to consider this, and he does a wonderful job, and I'll refer to some of what he says later. Here from the Hebrew Bible scholar and Jewish writer Joel Baden, and from Candida Moss, who's not a biblical scholar. Her work generally is on the martyr stories in the post-biblical era of early Christianity, but she's also a wide-ranging scholar, and they've written several books together. And this is on the origin and interpretation of the Hebrew word sara'at, which is the word translated as leprosy, in Leviticus 13 and 14. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But one of the main points they make is that many scholars, including scholars who've written major commentaries on Leviticus, assume various aspects of what a leper's relationship with society and with God would be that the evidence of the Bible just simply doesn't support, or at least doesn't support it uniformly. One is that leprosy is sent as a function of sin or as a punishment from God, and they highlight that some stories suggest that, but Leviticus 13 and 14 do not. And those are among the so-called priestly writings, and if you're not familiar with that, you might want to look at my early Genesis videos to see how some of the Pentateuch books, the early books in the Hebrew Bible, have been understood to be written by multiple authors across time. So the priestly author, writing from exile, attributes to leprosy simply a human condition, like childbirth or menstruation, that's not a result of sin or punishment, but does require paying attention to, not because of our modern sense of contagion from microorganisms, but from the observation that people near or touching people who had this condition could get it, which obviously isn't true about childbirth or menstruation. So I'm going to be using both those articles in what I have to offer here. And then finally, this from Godwin Etekumana from Africa, highlighting what this is like for an African society where there's much illness and not as much formal health care as there is in Western countries like the United States or perhaps in Europe. So we're going to look at the scene through the lens of all these people to help us. So let's bring up the Greek for us here so we can follow this along, and there'll be a number of places where the Greek is interesting for what we're going to look at. So again, once separating that from the previous scene, when he was in one of the cities, there was a man, and the translation, as it often does, leaves out the idu, kai idu, and behold, parallel to in Hebrew, vehenna. So the translators aren't noting here that the narrator is drawing our explicit attention to this. And behold, there is a man covered with leprosy, or literally full of leprosy, as my note below suggests, not so much a description of his skin as is of his being. He is full of leprosy. And then we get to the first use of the word lepra. And the first thing we need to note here is this is probably not a word that should be used anymore, and I would expect that more recent translations don't. Because the formal medical condition known as Hansen's disease, which is what the word leprosy points to, is not necessarily at all what the biblical word leprosy is pointing to. And many scholars, including medical doctors, have noted that this word lepra for leprosy, or the noun form for the person who has it as a leper, can refer to any skin condition at all, from psoriasis, which is relatively harmless, especially to others, not catching, to more intense elements. And if we were to look at Leviticus 13 and 14, which I won't right now, there are extensive and complex rules for what to do when someone has leprosy. But one thing is not to do is to send them away. And that's the challenge here. Even to my own notes I have from major scholars who suggest lepers were ostracized. And if you look at a picture like this from the classic Hawaiian leper colony, these lepers were not from Hawaii. These lepers were sent to Hawaii. Imagine being sent to Hawaii as a punishment. But of course it was a punishment because they were isolated from society and left with few resources. So in that context, that's where lepers were isolated, but not in our passage here, because as we can see, Jesus encounters this person in one of the cities. And one of the points that Baden and Moss make, is, as well as the other author that I showed you there, is that many scholars start with their presupposition and assume and work that here, so that what they see is the man doesn't belong in the city, but it shows how bold he is to want to come after Jesus by going in the city. But what these authors, modern authors, note is there was no prohibition of lepers being in the cities, and that might not be a fair presupposition at all. They need to stay away from other people, but not necessarily completely away. And what they conclude is it's really not clear what the first century relationship between lepers and society was. It's certainly not as clear as many scholars assume it is without finding actual evidence. So we'll keep that in mind as we go. When he saw Jesus, this says he bowed with his face to the ground, but literally he having fallen on his face. So it's not the formality of a bowing, just bowing down. It's the falling upon his face, much like Abraham does before God in Genesis. So he falls on his face and begged him. So immediately he's subservient to Jesus and yet asking. The word here for beg is a Lucan word you see in my note, 15 of 22 times in the New Testament or in Luke Acts, and it contains a connotation of urgency. And what he says is this: Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. The word for choose is simply the word for will or want, thelo here, and you hear if you are willing. And Jesus' answer is important, and let's look at that and see, because it's more succinct than the translation suggests. But finishing here, if you want to, if you choose, you can. Dunase, which is to say power, like dynamite and dynamic. So he expresses, you have the power to make me clean. It's just a matter of you choosing. The word for clean here, katharisai, from a root verb which is used in Luke almost exclusively in reference to lepers. So you see in my note below, the one exception is 11:39. The Pharisees are unclean on the inside, but clean the outside, which we'll see is deeply ironic there, because what's at stake here with the leper is the outside, not the inside. There's no sense that he's morally bad or that he's saying bad things or thinking bad things. It's simply a skin disease. The skin, the very definition of the outside of a person. So Luke uses cleanliness in relationship to leprosy virtually exclusively. The question of cleanliness brings up for scholars, so-called purity codes, the sense that people were welcome or not in society based on not physical cleanliness, but what is sometimes called ceremonial or ritual uncleanliness. And that's certainly what's at issue here. To be clean is to be fully accepted in society, and to be unclean is not. But again, that is not necessarily associated with sin or God's punishment. People can be unclean for participating in daily life in a mixed society where they touch a Gentile, for example, and they simply have to go through a ritual to cleanse themselves, but it's not a matter of moral fault. So it's not a matter of Jesus forgiving sin here. It's a matter of allowing this person to be fully included again in society. And so we see here in verse 13, and I won't look here at the biomedical issue in my note here, but Jesus stretched out his hand. And I think that's a poignant issue here, because he's bridging the distance, or in the words of our beloved friend Edward Loring from the Open Door community, formerly in Atlanta and now in Baltimore, the mission of people of privilege is to, in his words, reduce the distance between us and those that society marginalizes. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He's reaching out his hand and touched him. And this is the first time that Jesus is said to be touching somebody here. He didn't touch Peter's mother-in-law, who had the fever. Instead, he rebuked the fever. And so we saw in a couple of videos earlier a chart of the various ways that Jesus can heal by word or by touch or other things. So if you haven't seen that video, you might want to look at the website and see the reference to that. So Jesus touched him, and as we saw in the artistic images and the paintings, that touch bridges the distance and shows an intimacy here. And then he says, "I do choose." And let's look at the Greek here, so we can see how specifically, how clear the Greek is, and how narrow it is in terms of words. Thelo katharisthetai. I am willing, be cleansed, is simply 2 words in Greek, not the 6 words it is in English. And at once, immediately, euthios, not Luke's usual word for once, parakrema is, but this is usually Mark's word, the leprosy left him. Apelthen. It's one of a number of uses of komai words in this passage. I just want to bring that up here, because what we lose is the sound. So here, the leprosy left him, meaning to depart, and we see the same word here for in go. So left him and go is the same word here, aperkomai. But we'll also see in verse 15 and 14, diarkomai, to go through, sudarkomai, to come together, and prusukomai, which is to pray, which is literally to go toward God or divinity that way. So that's something that would be lost in English translation. It's not a matter of translation, but in English hearing, rather, the echoes of those words. So as soon as the leprosy leaves him, and we see the parallels are in Mark and Matthew. Mark in the beginning and Matthew after the Sermon on the Mount. He ordered him, parangelein, one of several uses of that word in Luke. And notice that 15 times in Luke Acts and only 3 times in other Gospels, although 30 times in the New Testament, underscoring the theme I've been looking at, that Luke is using a special vocabulary. He borrows vocabulary from Mark when he's using Mark, and he uses some generic words that everybody in Greek society would use, but he uses a number of vocabulary words not found elsewhere in the Gospels and often not found elsewhere in the New Testament, and this is one of them. So after he ordered him to tell no one, go and show yourself to the priest, and as Moses commanded, make an offering for your cleansing, for a testimony to them. And this can often lead Christian scholars who come up with the idea, especially from the Reformation, that Jesus rejected the law and Moses, and that the law was a Jewish perspective and grace is a Christian perspective. And as modern scholars have shown, that's simply anti-Semitism on the part of Christian scholars, that there's no sense that that's true at any level. That's just simply a dichotomous way of looking at things that raises Christianity up over Judaism. And so more recent scholars notice things like this example of many where Jesus, frankly, not ignoring the law, and as we see in Matthew's gospel, not one jot or tittle of the law will be put aside before it's all fulfilled. So Jesus is not in any way replacing the Torah, but as we saw, he's fulfilling it. He's making some of these provisions full. And the Jubilee passage in Leviticus is part of the Torah, part of what would be understood as Moses. So that's what the issue here. And he's referring to the Levitical passages here. So why would Jesus want this person to be shown to the priest? And we can see that priest is singular here, but them at the end of the sentence. And we see the references to priests in Luke. Of course, there are no Christian priests anywhere in the New Testament, nor does the New Testament ever suggest the possibility of a Christian priest, including in the letters of Paul, where he describes a number of ministries and gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 and 14. They're simply Jewish priests here. But one of the questions is Jesus acting in a priestly way without quote-unquote ordination, or without a family lineage of being a priest? Unlike John the Baptist, who is from a family lineage of being a priest out of his father Zechariah, who we saw in chapter 1 was a priest. So is this to confirm that Jesus is powerful, or is it to obey the law? In other words, it's a testimony to them, but what, as my note here says? Is it a testimony that Jesus can offer healing, or simply a testimony that the leper has been cleansed, and therefore the priest can offer their approval in accordance with Leviticus? That's ambiguous here. The word for show yourself here, dikon in the form, diknumai in its root, 33 times in the New Testament, but not a Septuagint word, but you can see where it is there in Luke and Acts. And so that's almost the end of our scene. We notice there's no response from the leper. He doesn't express joy, and we'll see in the other leprosy story in chapter 17, that's exactly the issue, is will any of the lepers come back to Jesus and express gratitude and thanks? But we don't hear anything about him. We don't see that he jumps up like the man at the beautiful gate in Acts 3, or is otherwise grateful. It's simply the leprosy left him. He orders him not to tell anyone, and we don't hear from any more. But despite the order not to tell anyone, we see in verse 15, now more than ever the word about Jesus spread abroad. And the word malon here is used as more than, rather than more than ever. So despite Jesus' attempt to keep it quiet for the sake of not having this programmatic revealing of who he is and is working in Galilee, be overwhelmed by crowds larger than he can contain. It's not a matter of keeping it secret, because he's plainly going out to proclaim the kingdom of God, but to at least keep it within bounds, but it's not within bounds. And it's easy to imagine why people couldn't keep that within bounds if they'd seen this happen. So the word about Jesus spread abroad. A diarketo, meaning to spread, but not necessarily abroad to foreign lands. So you can translate that one of different ways. A question of many crowds here, ukleis poli. The scholar Marshall in his commentary rejects the issue of many crowds instead of saying great crowds. So rather than saying the number of crowds, describing the largeness of the crowds. And that seems to make sense here. As the word spreads, the crowds are growing. And they're gathering to hear him and to be cured. And notice that that wasn't what we'd been told here happened. A unclean person was rendered clean. But the people are coming to be cured, as we saw in the summary at the end of chapter 4. But as this is happening, Jesus instead withdrew, left, and it's only one other time in the New Testament here, to wilderness places, eremos, as we saw just in chapter 4, and to pray. The last of our komai words here, and we see the examples of those there. So Jesus is not going to be overwhelmed by the crowds, and he's not going to be reactive. He's not going to respond to other people's demands, although in this case, Jesus encounters this person and chooses as the man asked him and as Jesus responds. So that's our first healing here and of leprosy. And one of the interesting things, and I didn't mention this earlier, I know I'm going on a little long here, but just to highlight that the Naaman the Syrian example from chapter 4 in people's minds as readers would really highlight the point that scholars seem to not notice, other than the more recent articles I noted, which is that Naaman is not isolated. He's a military commander, and he can go up to Elisha and Elijah and these people, and he's not isolated at all. He has a condition that needs to be healed, but his leprosy is not isolated him from society. So if readers are paying attention, they can know that the scholarly assumption that Jews excluded lepers completely from society is simply not held up by the biblical evidence. Okay, next session we're going to see the first time Pharisees in the story. See you then. Bye-bye.